Nottingham Cottage, Kensington Palace, autumn 1950. The rooms were quiet. A woman in her early 40s stood among half-packed cases in a residence she had been told was hers for life. The furniture had been chosen for her by Queen Mary. The curtains belonged to the crown. On the table lay magazine clippings and the proofs of a book, her book, that bore her name and described in affectionate detail the childhood of two princesses she had helped raise for 17 years. The telephone had stopped ringing weeks ago. The letters she sent to the palace went unanswered. The invitations that once arrived no longer came. Marion Crawford was not being escorted from the premises. There was no scene, no confrontation, no official letter. There was only silence. The particular administrative silence of an institution that had decided she no longer existed and was waiting, with centuries of practiced patience, for her to understand. The world outside those walls believed the House of Windsor was a family built on duty, gratitude, and loyalty rewarded. The family that Crawford had dressed and taught and comforted through a war and an abdication and 17 years of private life had shown her something different. Affection inside the palace was conditional. Memory was institutional property. And silence was not a preference. It was the price of the crown's survival. This is the story of the woman who helped raise a queen and was erased for describing what she saw. It spans 4 generations, 10 people, and 38 years of exile. It is the story of what the most famous family in the world did to the one person who knew them best, and what it cost her to have known them at all. But that scene, a woman packing inside a cottage she was told would be hers for life, was not where this story began. To understand how Marion Crawford ended up alone inside Nottingham Cottage with 17 years of service reduced to silence, you have to go back much further than the magazine articles, further than the book, further even than the princesses she helped raise. You have to go back to the invention of the family itself. This is the story of a dynasty that was built not on land or blood alone, but on a particular kind of performance. The performance of Britishness, of steadiness, of domestic warmth, projected outward for a nation that needed desperately to believe in it, and of the woman who helped sustain that performance from the inside and was destroyed when she tried to describe it from the outside. It is the story of a household, a code, a silence, and what that silence cost the one person who broke it. It spans 4 generations and 10 people. A king who never expected to reign, a queen consort who ruled the household with warmth and iron, 2 princesses raised inside a fortress of propriety, a governess who gave her best years to all of them, a husband who arrived too late, editors who saw a market in intimacy, an aristocrat who served as conduit, and the invisible apparatus of courtiers, private secretaries, and palace officials who decided, collectively, that the memory of a servant was less important than the reputation of a crown. The House of Windsor did not exist before 1917. That fact alone tells you something essential about the family Marion Crawford would later serve. The British royal family, as the 20th century came to know it, was a reinvention. Deliberate, strategic, and born not from tradition, but from fear. In the summer of that year, with German Gotha bombers dropping ordnance on London schoolchildren, an anti-German feeling running white-hot through the country like a contagion that could not be quarantined, King George V made a decision that was simultaneously cosmetic and existential. He renounced the name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, the dynastic title his family had carried since Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha married Queen Victoria in 1840 and replaced it with Windsor. The name came from a castle. It sounded English. It sounded old. It sounded like something that had always been there, rooted in the Berkshire limestone, part of the landscape rather than imported from a German duchy. That was precisely the point. The dynasty was not old, and not in that form, not under that name. But the name made it feel ancient, and in a constitutional monarchy whose survival depended on public sentiment rather than military power, feeling was the only currency that mattered. The rebranding was not a whim. It was an act of institutional self-preservation, at a moment when the institution had reason to believe it might not survive. By 1917, the British public was exhausted by war, grieving its sons, and suspicious of anything that carried a German accent. The Tsar had been overthrown in Russia that February, and although the full horror of what would follow was not yet known, the message was legible. Monarchy was not safe. Crowned heads were falling across the European continent in a cascade that had no obvious stopping point. The Kaiser still sat on the German throne, but would not for much longer. The Habsburgs were crumbling. The Romanovs were already doomed, and the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, however loyally it had served the British war effort, However genuinely George V considered himself an Englishman, however much he loathed his German relatives, carried a name that sounded like the name of the enemy, the king understood, with a clarity that may have saved his family, that the British public could love a monarchy that felt British and could not love one that felt foreign, and that the difference between those two feelings was, in the end, nothing more than a name. Lord Stamfordham, the king's private secretary, is credited with suggesting Windsor. The proclamation came on the 17th of July, 1917. The house and family of the king would henceforth be known as the House and Family of Windsor. It was, in its way, the founding act of the modern British monarchy, the moment the institution decided that survival depended not on divine right or constitutional theory, but on the active, continuous management of public perception. The Windsors would be British. They would be visible. They would be dutiful. They would appear at hospitals, at factories, at the front when necessary, and they would keep what happened inside their walls, inside their walls. That was the bargain. The public would see a family, the family would control what the public saw. And anyone inside the household who threatened that control would discover, as Marion Crawford would discover 3 decades later, that the affection of the Windsor machine was as conditional as its name was invented. There is something about that bargain worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the engine of everything that follows. The code that would later destroy Crawford, the absolute insistence on discretion, the treatment of private royal life as institutional property rather than personal memory, the belief that a household servant's recollections belong to the crown and not to the servant, did not descend from some ancient feudal principle. It was not inherited from the medieval court or written into the Constitution. It was born here in 1917 from a family that had watched other dynasties die and resolved that theirs would not. Silence was the survival mechanism. And because it worked, but because the rebrand held, because the public embraced the Windsors, because the monarchy emerged from the Great War intact while others were swept away, the code hardened into doctrine. By the 1930s, it was no longer a strategy. It was an article of faith. And by the time Crawford broke it, it was treated as something close to sacred. The code held through the 1920s under a king who embodied it with a kind of stubborn, gruff perfection. George V was not a complicated man in the ways that make for dramatic storytelling. He was disciplined, conventional, devoted to his stamps and his shooting, uncomfortable with modernity, and deeply suspicious of anything that deviated from the pattern. His queen, Mary of Teck, was equally formidable. Tall, straight-backed, a collector of antiques and protocol in equal measure, a woman who understood that monarchy was performance and that the costumes must never slip, not even in private, not even among family. Together they projected an image of unshakable British solidity. The Silver Jubilee of 1935 was greeted with a genuine outpouring of public affection that surprised even the king himself. He had not realized until that week how deeply the public had invested in the idea of a stable, steady British royal family. That investment was the family's greatest asset. It was also the thing that made any breach of the code feel like an act of sabotage against the nation itself. George and Mary raised their children inside a household that was warm by royal standards and rigid by any other. Their eldest son, David, the Prince of Wales, was charming, modern, restless, drawn to nightlife and American women and the kind of informality that his parents regarded with something between bewilderment and horror. He was also, by the mid-1930s, deeply and immovably in love with Wallis Simpson, American, twice divorced, socially impossible by the standards of the Church of England, the British government, and the Dominion prime ministers whose consent the king technically required for marriage. When George V died in January 1936, David became King Edward VIII. By December of that same year, less than 11 months after ascending to the throne, he had abdicated. The abdication of Edward VIII is one of the most retold events in British 20th century history, but its relevance to Crawford's story is specific and needs to be understood precisely. Edward chose Simpson over the crown. He chose personal desire over institutional duty. He chose disclosure. His abdication, broadcast on the 11th of December 1936, in which he told the nation he could not carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved, was the most intimate public statement a British monarch had ever made. And the result was chaos, constitutional crisis, a family fractured, a brother forced onto a throne he had never wanted, 2 small girls whose futures were rewritten in an afternoon, and a lesson, drawn by everyone who remained inside the household, that was as clear and as absolute as any commandment. Personal feeling, once allowed to override institutional discipline, could destroy the monarchy itself. The man who inherited the consequences was Albert Frederick Arthur George, Duke of York, who became King George VI upon his brother's departure. He was 41 years old. He had spent his entire life in his brother's shadow, quieter, less assured, less socially at ease. Burdened by a stammer so severe that public speaking was an ordeal requiring weeks of preparation and leaving him visibly drained. He had served in the Royal Navy, had been present at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, had developed a dutiful commitment to public service that was genuine and deep, but that could never quite disguise the anxiety beneath it. He was prone to what the household privately called his gnashes, eruptions of frustration and temper that those closest to him learned to weather and forgive. He smoked heavily. He worried constantly. He suffered from chronic stomach problems. He had married Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923 precisely because the life of a second son offered the prospect of something manageable, something domestic, something that did not require him to stand in front of microphones and fight his own throat for every syllable. The abdication took that prospect away and gave him instead the one thing he had most dreaded: the crown, the spotlight, the speeches, the weight. But it also gave his family an image of extraordinary power. George VI, the reluctant king. Elizabeth, the steadfast queen. Two little princesses in matching coats and hats waving from the balcony of Buckingham Palace, their smiles reproduced in newspapers and newsreels until they became symbols rather than children. The contrast with Edward's self-indulgent abdication was deliberate and potent. Here was duty answering desire. Here was sacrifice redeeming selfishness. The British public, shaken by the abdication crisis and anxious about the gathering threat from the continent, embraced the new family with something approaching relief. They needed to believe that the monarchy was solid. The Windsors gave them every reason to believe it, and the woman tasked with helping manage the private side of that image, the daily emotional reality of two small girls growing up inside a performance that the nation depended on, was a 20-something Scottish governess from Dunfermline who had no idea that the warmth she was helping to create would one day be used as evidence against her. Marion Crawford was born on the 5th of June 1909 in Gateshead, near Dunfermline in Fife. She grew up not in the world of country houses and London seasons, but in the Scottish professional middle class. That stratum of society where education was revered as both a moral good and a means of advancement, where a sharp mind and a teaching qualification could take a young woman into houses far grander than the one she came from, and where the distance between service and equality was understood instinctively, even when it was never discussed. She trained as a teacher at the Moray House College of Education in Edinburgh, graduated in 1931, and found work almost immediately as a governess in titled Scottish families. She was 22. She was bright, energetic, well-trained, genuinely interested in children, and possessed of the particular social skill required of a woman in her position: the ability to be warm without being presumptuous, useful without being ambitious, present without being visible. That skill brought her into the York household in the early 1930s. She entered 145 Piccadilly, the family's Mayfair townhouse, their home before the abdication, and found a world that was simultaneously grand and surprisingly intimate. The Duke came home for tea. The Duchess managed the nursery with relaxed authority. The girls were small, energetic, and cared for by a staff that included a nanny, Ellen Knight, and various other household members. Crawford's role was to teach, and to teach in a particular way. The Queen Consort, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, did not want her daughters pushed academically. She wanted them to be well-read, well-mannered, and charming, not intellectuals. Crawford taught history, geography, arithmetic, grammar, poetry, and scripture. She also taught something less formal. She was the person who took the girls outside the palace walls, who showed them something of the ordinary Britain they would one day represent. She organized Girl Guide meetings. She supervised swimming lessons. She walked them through parks and high streets, and on one famous occasion, took them on the London Underground. She had no wealth of her own. She had no title. She had no family connections that would protect her if she ever fell from favor. She had only her competence, her warmth, and her willingness to be needed. That willingness was her greatest gift and eventually her ruin. The woman who controlled the household Crawford entered was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, and to understand what happened to Crawford, you have to understand what kind of woman she was. Born on the 4th of August 1900, the ninth of 10 children of Claude Bowes Lyon, 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, she had grown up between Glamis Castle and Angus, a vast, turreted Scottish pile steeped in centuries of family mythology, including a rumored monster in a secret room, and St. Paul's Walden Bury in Hertfordshire, the family's English estate. Her childhood was aristocratic, comfortable, large-familied, and shaped by the confident ease of the Edwardian landed gentry. She was socially deft, emotionally perceptive, capable of putting anyone at ease, and possessed of a will that those who underestimated her charm tended to discover too late. She had turned down the Duke of York's proposal at least once, possibly twice, before accepting in 1923, not because she did not care for him, but because she understood, with the precision that characterized everything she did, what marrying into the royal family would mean for her freedom. She married him anyway, and when the abdication thrust her husband onto the throne and her into the role of queen consort, she did not flinch. She built, with remarkable speed and skill, the public image of a family that embodied duty, warmth, and British resilience. She stood beside her husband during his agonized speeches. She visited bombed streets during the Blitz. She refused to send the princesses to Canada when the war came, declaring that the children could not go without their mother. The mother would not leave the king, and the king would never leave. The public adored her. The household feared her. Gently, respectfully, but with a clear understanding that the warmth she projected concealed a core of absolute resolution. Her rule to Crawford was the rule that governed everything. People in positions of confidence with the royal family had to be, in her memorable phrase, utterly oyster. The shell stayed closed. The inner life stayed hidden. You did this not because you were ordered to, but because you understood that the survival of the institution that had just barely survived the abdication, that had rebuilt itself around this family, that had asked the British public to believe in it again, depended on absolute discretion. That was the code. That was the inheritance being passed down through the women of this household. From Queen Mary's rigid formality to the Queen Consort's more supple but equally unyielding control to the young Elizabeth's own dawning understanding that duty meant, among other things, keeping the private life of the crown forever private. The elder princess, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, born the 21st of April 1926 at 17 Bruton Street in Mayfair, was the child most perfectly suited to absorb that inheritance. By every account of her childhood, she was a serious girl, orderly, conscientious, self-contained, inclined to arrange her shoes in lines, to make her bed before being asked, to approach even small tasks with a methodical gravity that struck adults as remarkable. Crawford taught her from approximately the age of 6 until Elizabeth was 21. That is a span of time so vast and so foundational that it is difficult to overstate what it meant. Crawford was there for the schoolroom lessons, for the wartime anxieties, for the Girl Guide meetings, for the first stirrings of romantic interest in Philip Mountbatten, for the slow crystallization of a personality that was built, and partly by nature, partly by training, and partly by Crawford herself, for the throne. Elizabeth was the student who absorbed the Windsor Code so completely that she became its most rigorous enforcer. She would later refuse to speak to Crawford for the rest of her life. She would refuse to send flowers to her funeral. And she would do both of these things not from cruelty, but from a conviction. Bred in the nursery, Crawford had managed that loyalty to the institution came before every personal attachment. Margaret Rose, born the 21st of August 1930 at Glamis Castle, was the child the code could not entirely contain. She was vivid where Elizabeth was measured. She was witty, musical, emotionally direct, given to sharp observations that delighted adults and sometimes alarmed the household. She could mimic, she could sing, she could command a room's attention before she was old enough to understand what she was commanding. She had what one might call the problem of despair, a phrase that would not enter public vocabulary for decades, but that described a predicament as old as monarchy itself. The younger sibling who is loved equally in the nursery but valued differently by the institution, who shares the same childhood and the same governess and the same parents, but inherits none of the purpose. Margaret would spend her adult life discovering what it meant to be royal without being necessary, to carry the restrictions of the name without the compensating weight of the role. That discovery would make her one of the most complicated figures in the modern monarchy. But in the schoolroom with Crawford, she was simply the younger sister, warmer, more spontaneous, less guarded, less careful. Crawford adored both girls, but Margaret's affection was less filtered through the awareness of future duty that governed Elizabeth's every gesture. She did not have a throne to prepare for. She had instead an undefined position that offered freedom and confinement in equal measure, and a temperament that would eventually find both insufficient. Her attachment to Crawford was open, unmediated, and because it was never disciplined by the same institutional logic that shaped her sister's emotions, all the more painful when it was severed. George Buthley appeared in Crawford's life at the moment when the deferred years began to exact their cost. She married him in 1947, the same year she left royal service. He was a former bank employee, a practical man, and the strongest later accounts suggest that he encouraged Crawford to see her 17 years of royal proximity not merely as a completed chapter, but as a marketable asset. Whether this was calculated manipulation, reasonable ambition, or simply the practical instinct of a man who understood that his wife's pension would not stretch as far as the memories deserved is a question the sources do not settle. What matters is the dynamic he introduced: a second loyalty, a second voice in the household, and a perspective that could see the commercial value of intimacy in a way that Crawford, shaped by years of service, might not have reached alone. And then there was the apparatus itself, and the private secretaries, the courtiers, the equerries, the ladies in waiting, the dressers and valets, and household staff who kept the machinery of the monarchy running. These are the people who rarely appear in public histories, but who controlled the daily reality of palace life: who was invited and who was frozen out, whose telephone calls were returned and whose were not, whose letters reached the queen's desk and whose vanished into filing cabinets. In this story, the apparatus functions almost as a character in its own right. The collective institutional will that decided, sometime in 1949 or 1950, that Marion Crawford had moved from the category of trusted former servant to the category of threat, and that acted accordingly. The household that formed around all of these people in the years before the war was a place of genuine tenderness, governed by absolute hierarchy. At 145 Piccadilly, the rhythm of the York family was domestic in a way that seems almost unimaginable for the dynasty it would become. The Duke arrived home in the evenings and played with the girls in the nursery. The Duchess managed the social calendar and the household with the light touch of a woman born to the gentry. The princesses had tea, played with their corgis, squabbled over games, and received Crawford each morning for lessons that balanced education with the queen consort's insistence that learning should never overwhelm charm. Crawford described the Piccadilly house with evident tenderness in her later writing: a home that felt warm, contained, and safe, a place where a governess could be welcomed into family rituals without ever being confused for family. Then came December 1936, and the world inside 145 Piccadilly ended. The abdication moved the family to Buckingham Palace. Elizabeth, 10 years old, was now heir presumptive. Margaret, 6, was despair. George VI was learning painfully to be king. The queen consort was constructing, with formidable speed and conviction, the public image of a household that embodied steadiness in a world that felt increasingly dangerous, and Crawford was asked to do something that no royal governess had been asked to do in quite the same way before: to raise two children who were simultaneously ordinary girls and symbols of national continuity, to give them enough contact with the world outside the palace that they could one day represent it believably, and to do all of this inside a system that regarded any uncontrolled contact with that outside world as contamination. She did it. She did it for the next 11 years. She took Elizabeth and Margaret to Woolworth's on the 15th of May 1939 and watched them buy threepenny toys while the shop assistants had no idea who they were. She took them on the Underground, St. James's Park to Tottenham Court Road, and watched the future queen navigate a ticket machine and an escalator with the careful determination she applied to everything. She formed the first Buckingham Palace company of girl guides so the princesses could tie knots and earn badges alongside other girls their own age, even if those other girls had been carefully selected and vetted. She managed wartime lessons at Windsor Castle, while the household operated under a code of cheerful denial in which bombing raids were real, but discussion of bombing raids was not. She recalled that unpleasant or bothersome matters were never discussed. 8 words that capture the entire Windsor philosophy. Fear was felt. It was not spoken. And Crawford's job was to stand between the girls and the fear, to be the membrane that made the silence feel like safety rather than suppression. She became indispensable. She also became trapped. Because the longer she stayed, the deeper the bond grew. And the deeper the bond grew, the harder it was to imagine a life outside the household, and the harder it was to imagine that life, the more completely the family assumed she would always be there. Crawford was not a prisoner. She could have left, but the emotional architecture of the household made leaving feel like a betrayal of the very bond that made leaving necessary. She watched her 20s pass. She watched her 30s arrive. She watched the girls grow from small children into adolescents and young women. And she knew every stage of that growth more intimately than almost anyone in the world. She knew what Elizabeth looked like when she was worried. She knew what Margaret sounded like when she was lonely. She knew the texture of their days, the rhythm of their moods, the unspoken geography of a household that ran on affection and obedience in measures so finely calibrated that no outsider could have mapped them. Even when Elizabeth was grown, at 21, engaged to Philip Mountbatten, preparing for the life she had been trained for since the age of 10, Crawford was expected to remain. She had delayed her own marriage for years. She had set aside her own ambitions, her own desires, her own claim on the years between 22 and 39. The family had not asked her to do this explicitly. They had simply made it clear, in the way that institutions make things clear without ever saying them aloud, that her presence was expected and her absence would be noted. When she finally left in 1947, the parting gifts were generous. She married George Boothleigh. She received the Royal Victorian Order, a personal honor in the sovereign's gift. She was given a pension, and she was given Nottingham Cottage, a grace-and-favour residence on the grounds of Kensington Palace, furnished in part with pieces that Queen Mary herself had helped select. The old Queen's gesture was characteristic, generous, practical, and laden with the assumption that a servant so rewarded would understand that the account was closed. The cottage was meant to be security. It was also a kind of cage. It kept Crawford physically inside the world she had served, on the palace grounds, a short walk from the rooms she had occupied. While placing her emotionally outside it, she was no longer needed, she was no longer consulted, she was no longer part of the daily rhythm. She was a retired governess in a borrowed house with 17 years of intimate knowledge and no sanctioned way to speak about any of it. She had given her youth to the most famous family in the world, and the family had given her a cottage, a medal, and the expectation of permanent silence. That was the position she was in when the letter arrived from New York. Bruce and Beatrice Gould, editors of the Ladies' Home Journal, one of the most widely read magazines in America, with a circulation in the millions, had heard that the former royal governess might be willing to share her memories. They wanted warm, affectionate, intimate stories about the little princesses for an American readership that had fallen in love with the idea of Elizabeth and Margaret during the war years. They were willing to pay well. They were willing to give Crawford something the palace had never given her and would never give her, a byline, her own name attached to her own memories, printed in a publication that millions of people would read. It was the most generous offer Crawford had ever received. It was also the one thing the House of Windsor could not permit. And what happened next and what the family did, what the palace apparatus decided, what it cost the woman who had raised a queen, would prove that the code born in 1917 in a moment of wartime survival had become something far colder and more absolute than its creators could have imagined. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. But before any of that could unfold, and before the letter from New York could detonate the life Crawford had built inside the palace grounds, there were the years themselves, the years she would later try to put into words, the years the palace would insist she had no right to describe. And to understand why those years mattered enough to destroy a woman over, you have to see them not as summary, but as lived experience. The texture of days, the rhythm of rooms, the small accumulations of intimacy that made Crawford's knowledge feel to the family like something too dangerous to let her keep. The best years began before the war and deepened during it. At 145 Piccadilly, the household had a quality that Crawford would later describe as being unlike anything she had imagined royal life to be. The rooms were large but not palatial. The corridors did not echo. The family ate together, played together, kept hours that would not have seemed unusual in any prosperous London household. The Duke of York came home in the evenings and rough-housed with the girls in the nursery, while the Duchess looked on with an indulgence that was genuine and precisely calibrated. Elizabeth, even at 6 or 7, would try to manage the roughhousing, arranging the cushions, setting rules, making sure Margaret did not get too wild. Margaret, naturally, got too wild. She climbed things. She shouted. She made faces at visitors through banisters. Crawford watched all of it, And what she saw was not a fairy tale, but something more interesting. A real family with real temperaments, operating inside a framework of privilege that magnified every dynamic. The love was real, the hierarchy was real, and the gap between the two was the space Crawford occupied for the next 17 years. After the abdication moved the family to Buckingham Palace, the dynamic shifted. The corridors were longer, the staff more numerous, the atmosphere more formal. Elizabeth, now heir presumptive at 10, began to carry herself differently. Not overnight, not dramatically, but with a seriousness that Crawford noticed and that would only deepen over the years. Margaret, 6, did not change. She remained vivid, noisy, emotionally transparent, the child who said what she thought and expected to be loved for it. Crawford managed the contrast between them daily. She taught lessons in a schoolroom that was now inside the largest working palace in the world, with footmen passing in the corridors and state business being conducted floors below, while two girls conjugated French verbs and drew maps of the British Empire. She kept to a timetable: arithmetic in the morning, history after lunch, geography on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Dancing and music and swimming fitted around the academic work. The Vice Provost of Eton, Sir Henry Martin, was brought in to teach Elizabeth constitutional history, and Crawford would sit in on those lessons, watching the future queen absorb the machinery of the state with a concentration that was almost unnerving in a child. Margaret was not given the same instruction. The spare did not need to understand the Constitution. That distinction, small and administrative, would echo through both their lives. The outings Crawford organized during those years were small acts of subversion inside a controlled world. The Woolworths visit, threepenny toys purchased with pocket money, the princesses unrecognized among the shoppers, was a triumph of ordinariness. The Girl Guide troupe was another, the first Buckingham Palace company, formed so Elizabeth and Margaret could earn badges and tie knots alongside other girls, even if the other girls had been carefully selected from the families of palace employees and courtiers. Crawford understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the household, that the princesses needed to know what ordinary Britain looked like, because they would one day be asked to represent it, and representation without understanding would be hollow. The queen consort approved of these outings in principle. She also monitored them carefully. Nothing was uncontrolled. Nothing was unsupervised. The membrane between the palace and the world was permeable in one direction only. Crawford could take the girls out briefly, but the world could not come in. The tube ride on the 15th of May, 1939, was the pinnacle of Crawford's campaign for normality. She took both princesses from St. James's Park Station to Tottenham Court Road on the Underground. Elizabeth, 13, navigated the ticket machine and the escalator with the methodical care she applied to everything. Margaret, 8, treated the whole excursion as an adventure and had to be prevented from talking to strangers. They bought sweets. They rode the escalator back up. They returned to the palace. It was by any measure a trivial outing, but it was also one of the most intimate moments in the story, because it showed Crawford doing the thing she was genuinely good at, making the extraordinary children she cared for feel, for an hour, like ordinary ones. That hour would later be published. The palace would later treat that publication as betrayal, and the question at the heart of the story would crystallize: who owned that memory? The woman who created it, or the family whose children were in it? Then the war came, and the household changed again. George VI commuted between Windsor and London. The Queen Consort refused to leave the capital, visiting bombed-out streets in silk and pearls, projecting the image of a woman who shared the danger without being diminished by it. The princesses were kept at Windsor Castle, behind stone walls and blackout curtains, in a world that was simultaneously ancient and besieged. Crawford managed their education through the war years with a resourcefulness that the later narrative of betrayal has obscured. She adapted the curriculum. She organized entertainments. She kept the daily timetable as close to normal as conditions allowed, because normality was the only tool she had against the fear that the household refused to name. The Christmas pantomimes were characteristic of Crawford's approach. Each year during the war, the princesses performed a pantomime for an invited audience of household staff, estate workers, and local children at Windsor. Crawford helped organize them. Elizabeth was earnest, committed, determined to get every line right. Margaret stole the show. She had inherited from somewhere in the Bowes-Lyon temperament a gift for mimicry and comic timing that nobody had taught her and that Crawford delighted in. The pantomimes were small, amateur, domestic, and they were also acts of morale. proof that the household could produce joy even when German bombers were audible from the castle's terraces on certain nights. Crawford understood the dual function instinctively. She was managing the girl's emotional welfare. She was also maintaining the household's carefully constructed atmosphere of normality. The two tasks were the same task, and she performed both with a professionalism that the family took for granted because taking it for granted was easier than acknowledging what it cost her. During the worst of the Blitz, when bombs fell close enough to rattle the windows at Windsor and the King's London routine included visits to bombed-out neighborhoods where the dust had not yet settled, Crawford held the domestic line. She sat with the girls during air raids. She supervised homework while the sounds of anti-aircraft fire carried faintly from the direction of London. She maintained the fiction, not entirely a fiction, because fiction maintained long enough becomes its own kind of truth. That the war was something happening outside the household rather than inside it. Unpleasant or bothersome matters were never discussed. Crawford adhered to the rule. She kept the conversation on lessons, on pets, on the small dramas of girlhood that were manageable precisely because they were small. But she knew what was happening. She knew the danger. She knew that the king slept badly and smoked too much, and that the queen's composure was held together by will rather than serenity. She knew these things because she lived among them, and living among them made her in the palace's eventual judgment a witness whose testimony could never be permitted. The bond between Crawford and Elizabeth during these years took on a particular quality. Elizabeth was growing from a child into a young woman, and Crawford was the adult woman closest to that transformation. She watched Elizabeth develop the self-discipline that would define her reign, the capacity to absorb disappointment without showing it, to manage emotion without suppressing it entirely, to present a face to the world that was calm and competent while the reality behind it was more complicated. Crawford also watched Elizabeth fall in love. Philip Mountbatten, a Greek prince with German family connections, a naval officer with the confidence of someone who had learned early that charm and determination could compensate for a complicated background, began appearing in Elizabeth's conversation and correspondence during the war years. Crawford witnessed the attachment forming. She saw the princess's face change when Philip's name was mentioned. She noticed the letters that arrived and the care with which they were read. That observation was intimate in the deepest sense. It was the knowledge of a young woman's heart held by the woman who had helped form it. The palace would later insist that such knowledge belonged to the family and not to Crawford, but Crawford had been there. She had seen it, and she would eventually describe it. Crawford's personal life during these years was almost entirely subordinate to the family's needs. She was in her 30s. She was unmarried. She had professional qualifications, energy, intelligence, and no life of her own beyond the schoolroom and the palace corridors. Whether she resented this is something the sources do not fully reveal, and the script should not pretend to certainty where none exists. What is clear is that she stayed. Year after year, she stayed. She stayed through Elizabeth's adolescence, through Margaret's transition from child to teenager, through the end of the war and the celebrations that followed, through Elizabeth's growing attachment to Philip Mountbatten, an attachment Crawford witnessed from the inside, watching the serious young woman she had helped raise fall in love with a naval officer whose Greek royal blood and German family connections made the palace nervous. She stayed until Elizabeth was 21 and engaged. She stayed until the family at last acknowledged that 17 years was enough. And even then, the departure felt less like a natural ending than like something being torn. There is something about the length of that service worth pausing over. 17 years. Crawford entered the household as a woman of 22 and left it as a woman approaching 40. She had given the family the years in which most people build their own lives, marry, have children, establish careers, form the relationships that sustain them through middle and old age. Crawford had done none of those things. She had instead poured those years into other people's children, other people's household, other people's story. The family had not forced her to do this. They had simply made it clear that her presence was valued, her departure would be inconvenient, and her reward would come later. Later arrived in 1947, and it looked on paper like a generous settlement. The Royal Victorian Order, a pension, a husband, and Nottingham Cottage, the grace-and-favour residence on the Kensington Palace grounds that was meant to be the final chapter. It was not the final chapter. It was the beginning of the crisis, because the cottage placed Crawford in a position that was psychologically impossible. She was inside the palace walls, but outside the palace life. She could see the buildings where she had spent her professional existence, but could not enter them in the old way. She was Mrs. Buthley now, a married woman with a husband and a household of her own. But the household was a borrowed one, furnished with another family's generosity, located on another family's grounds, maintained at another family's pleasure. The emotional geography was suffocating. She had traded 17 years of intimate involvement for a kind of proximity that offered no intimacy at all, only the memory of it sharpening with every passing month. The adjustment was harder than anyone around her seems to have anticipated. Crawford had spent her entire adult life inside a structure that gave her purpose, status, daily routine, and emotional connection. The structure was hierarchical, certainly. It was constraining, certainly. But it was also legible. She knew who she was inside it. She was Crawfie. She was the governess. She was the woman who took the princesses to Woolworths. Outside the structure, she was something less defined. A retired employee, a pensioner, a woman in her late 30s with no children of her own, living in a cottage that belonged to someone else, married to a man whose ambitions were different from hers, and carrying a weight of memory that had no outlet. The family did not visit. The family did not call. The transition from daily intimacy to total absence was not gradual. It was abrupt, and the abruptness was itself a kind of message. The relationship had been professional, not personal. And now that the professional element was concluded, the personal element simply ceased to exist. George Boothly occupied the space that the palace had vacated. He was practical where Crawford was sentimental. He understood that his wife's knowledge of the royal family, the private details, the childhood anecdotes, the domestic textures that no one outside the household had ever been permitted to know, had value. Not sentimental value, commercial value. The post-war reading public was hungry for royal content. The American market in particular was insatiable. Magazines wanted warmth, personality, the human beings behind the crowns. And here was a woman who had spent 17 years inside the most private rooms of the most famous family in the world, sitting in a borrowed cottage, living on a pension, with a husband who could see what the palace could not. That the silence expected of her was also from a certain angle an asset she had earned and was being denied the right to use. Whether Buthley pushed Crawford toward publication or whether she arrived there on her own is a question that the strongest sources do not settle with certainty, and honesty requires acknowledging the ambiguity. Later courtier accounts lean heavily toward Boothly as the instigator, the mercenary husband who corrupted the loyal governess. That version is convenient for the palace because it preserves Crawford as a naive victim rather than an agent. The truth is likely more complicated. Crawford had ambitions of her own. She had training. She had intelligence. She had spent 17 years constructing a story that nobody else could tell. And the desire to tell it was not necessarily planted by a scheming husband. It may simply have been the natural consequence of a life deferred too long. The approach from the Ladies' Home Journal came in 1949. Bruce and Beatrice Gould were not tabloid journalists. They were editors of one of the most respected women's magazines in America, with a circulation that ran into the millions and a readership that was middle class, aspirational, and warmly disposed toward the British monarchy. They wanted affectionate material, the princesses' children, the domestic rhythms of the palace, the kind of warm, intimate detail that would make American readers feel closer to a family they already admired. There was nothing lurid in what they proposed. They were not looking for scandal. They were looking for sentiment. The initial arrangement, as later reported, appeared manageable. The Queen Consort was informed. Crawford was told she could advise the magazine and be paid for her assistance on the understanding that her name would not appear and that the family would retain oversight of the material. That looked like a reasonable compromise. Controlled disclosure for a friendly audience, with the palace maintaining its grip on the narrative. It even fitted a certain post-war soft power logic. Affectionate royal content placed in an American magazine could only strengthen the transatlantic relationship and the monarchy's international image. The Queen Consort, for all her insistence on the Oyster Code, was not so rigid that she could not see the value of managed warmth directed at the right audience. The fatal detail was contractual, and it is worth being precise about it. The document Crawford signed with the Goulds contained a clause, described in later accounts as vague, perhaps deliberately so, that allowed for publication under Crawford's own name and potentially without final royal consent. Whether Crawford understood the full implications of that clause, whether she read it carefully, whether Buthley advised her to accept it, whether the Goulds explained what it would mean in practice, none of this is settled. What is settled is that by the time the palace realized what the contract permitted, the control they had assumed they retained had already leaked away. The clause was a crack in the oyster shell, and cracks in the House of Windsor were treated as catastrophes. The first fracture came in October 1949, and it arrived not as a public scandal, but as a private one, enacted through manuscript pages, handwritten annotations, and the channels of elite social circulation that the British upper classes used to police their own. Nancy Astor, Viscountess Astor, the first woman to take her seat in Parliament, an Anglo-American socialite of formidable influence and equally formidable opinions, a woman who moved between the palace and the press with the ease of someone who understood both worlds and feared neither, served as the conduit. The manuscript of Crawford's memoir, or a substantial portion of it, was sent to Lady Astor for review. Whether this was Crawford's idea, the Gould's idea, or Boothlay's idea is not entirely clear. What is clear is that Lady Astor did what anyone in her position would have done. She passed it to the Queen Consort. She may have done so with the expectation that the response would be manageable. She may have done so precisely because she anticipated the explosion and believed the Queen Consort needed to know. Either way, the manuscript crossed the threshold between the publishing world and the palace, and the moment it did, everything changed. The scene should be imagined not as a confrontation, but as a paper exercise. Quiet, domestic, and devastating. The Queen Consort, sitting in her private rooms at Clarence House or wherever she received her correspondence that autumn, reading a manuscript that described her daughter's childhoods in language that was affectionate, specific, and appallingly intimate. Crawford had written about the nursery, the schoolroom, the family's daily rhythms. She had described the king's moods and the queen's management of them. She had described the princesses as children, their habits, their squabbles, their small joys and fears, with the kind of detail that only someone who had been there every day for 17 years could provide. The material was not hostile. It was not critical. By any reasonable standard, it was admiring, even loving, but that was precisely what made it dangerous. Because if Crawford could describe the private life of the royal family with affection and specificity, and attach her own name to it, then the entire apparatus of silence that the institution depended on was compromised. The oyster had been opened, and it did not matter that what was inside was a pearl rather than a poison. The shell was broken. That was the offense. The Queen Consort's reported reaction was blunt. Crawford, she said, had gone off her head. She annotated passages. She requested removals. She communicated through the private channels available to a woman of her position and temperament that the family was not merely displeased but outraged, a cold institutional outrage that was more dangerous than any public fury because it would be enacted through withdrawal rather than confrontation. There would be no shouting match. There would be no dramatic scene. There would simply be a closing of ranks so complete that Crawford would eventually find herself on the wrong side of every door she had once been welcomed through. That response transformed the situation. Before the Queen Consort read the manuscript, Crawford was a retired governess exploring a publishing opportunity. After, she was a security breach. The distinction mattered because it changed the way the palace apparatus treated her. She was no longer a woman to be managed. She was a woman to be contained, and if containment failed, to be punished. The family's internal logic demanded it. If Crawford could publish, the question became immediate and structural. Who was next? If a governess could describe the princess's childhood, what prevented a dresser from describing the queen's wardrobe, a private secretary from describing the king's temper, a footman from describing what he overheard at dinner? The palace did not see Crawford's memoir as a single book. It saw it as a precedent, and precedent in an institution that survived on silence was existential. Crawford herself may not have fully understood the shift. The strongest accounts suggest she believed, even after the Queen Consort's anger became known, that the material was essentially harmless, warm, personal, affectionate, the kind of thing that would endear the public to the family rather than damage it. She was not wrong about the content. She was catastrophically wrong about the context. In the world outside the palace, a fond memoir by a beloved governess was a charming publishing event. Inside the palace, it was a violation of the code that held the institution together, committed by someone who should have understood the code better than anyone because she had lived inside it for 17 years. The early consequences were not yet total severance, but the architecture of severance was being assembled. The relationship between Crawford and the palace entered a poisoned middle ground, a period in which the breach was known but not yet public, in which outrage was circulating through the private channels of the court but had not yet reached the newspapers, in which Crawford might still have pulled back but did not, or could not, or would not. Boothleigh, by the accounts that mention him in this period, did not encourage retreat. The Goulds, who had a magazine to fill and a contract to honor, did not encourage retreat. And Crawford herself, who had spent 17 years deferring her own voice, may have found that the prospect of finally being heard was more powerful than the fear of being punished. Each person in this story was now, in the autumn of 1949, living inside a different version of the same event. The Queen Consort saw an act of treachery that endangered the institution she had spent her adult life protecting. She had welcomed Crawford into her home. She had trusted her with her children. She had allowed her to see the family at its most private, the king's moods, the queen's anxieties, the girl's vulnerabilities, and the idea that any of that might now appear in an American magazine under the governess's own name was experienced not as an inconvenience, but as a violation. Crawford saw something entirely different. She saw 17 years of devotion being acknowledged at last in the form of a warm, affectionate account that would make the public love the family more, not less. She could not understand why affection was being treated as aggression, why warmth was being received as threat. The Goulds saw a commercial opportunity that was more complicated than they had anticipated, but far too valuable to walk away from. The material was gold, intimate, specific, charming, and the American public would devour it. Elizabeth, 23 years old and recently a mother, Prince Charles had been born in November 1948, was moving deeper into the sovereign life that Crawford had helped prepare her for. Her silence on the matter was not yet public, but it was already complete. She did not intercede on Crawford's behalf. She did not send a private message of reassurance. She did not suggest that the family's response might be disproportionate. Whether this was because she agreed with her mother's position, or because she understood that disagreeing with her mother on a matter of household discipline was not something a princess did, or because the Windsor Code was by now so deeply embedded in her character that she could not imagine any response other than closure, that is a question the sources do not answer. What they do answer is the result. Elizabeth said nothing. The silence of the future queen was, in its way, the most devastating consequence of all, because it was Crawford who had helped teach her that silence. Margaret, 19, was in a different position. She was not yet the public figure she would become. She was not yet burdened by the institutional restrictions that would define her adult life. The Townsend affair, the impossible marriage, the decades of being royal without being necessary. But she was old enough to understand what was happening, and her closeness to Crawford made the breach personal in a way it was not for Elizabeth. Whether Margaret felt grief, anger, confusion, or some combination of all three is not recorded with certainty. What is recorded is that she too fell silent. The family's response was collective. The institution demanded it. And the institution, as Crawford was discovering, always won. George VI, whose health was beginning to decline in ways that would not become public for another year, had concerns that went far beyond a governess's memoir. He was dealing with the aftermath of Indian independence, the reshaping of the Commonwealth, and the daily physical toll of a reign he had never sought. Whether the Crawford affair occupied much of his attention is doubtful. What mattered was his wife's judgment, and his wife's judgment was clear. The decisions made in those autumn weeks of 1949 would have consequences that stretched across decades. The family chose closure over engagement. They chose punishment over negotiation. They chose the code over the person. And Crawford, perhaps believing that the situation was still retrievable, perhaps advised by Boothleigh that the contract was sound and the material was harmless, perhaps simply unable to accept that the people she had loved and served for 17 years were capable of discarding her, did not pull back. The manuscript remained with the Goulds, the contract remained in force, and the publication that would transform a private quarrel into a public event was now, at most, months away. The manuscript had been seen. The family had reacted. But the public had not yet read a word. The articles had not been printed. Crawford's name had not yet appeared on a byline. Everything that had happened so far, the approach, the contract, the manuscript, the Queen Consort's fury, the annotated pages, the closing of ranks, had taken place inside the private world of palace and publishing house and aristocratic drawing room, invisible to the millions of readers who would eventually consume the material. What came next would move the crisis from private outrage to public event, from a family quarrel conducted through intermediaries to an irreversible breach that would be read by millions, debated in newspapers, celebrated by some and condemned by others, and used for the rest of Crawford's life as the justification for her complete and permanent erasure from the world she had served. The palace had seen the manuscript. The public had not. The distance between private knowledge and public exposure was the last remaining barrier between Crawford and the consequences the institution had already decided she deserved. It was about to fall. The articles appeared in America in early 1950, and the barrier between private outrage and public event dissolved overnight. Crawford's name was on the byline. Her memories were on the page. The Ladies' Home Journal printed the material with the kind of prominent placement that signaled confidence in a sensation, prominent cover billing, serialization across multiple issues, editorial framing that presented Crawford as a uniquely authoritative source on the real lives of the princesses. And the American reading public responded exactly as the Goulds had anticipated, with delight. Here were the little princesses as real children, Elizabeth arranging her shoes, Margaret climbing furniture, the two of them squabbling and laughing and doing the things that ordinary sisters did, rendered by a woman who had been there for all of it and who described it with the specific, unpretentious detail of someone who had no literary agenda, only memories. The warmth was genuine, the detail was specific, the tone was admiring, and none of that mattered because what the American public received as charm, the British palace received as detonation. To understand what the publication meant in practice, you have to understand the media landscape of 1950. The Ladies' Home Journal was not a fringe publication. It was one of the most widely circulated magazines in America, read by millions of women across the country, a pillar of the post-war American middle class. Its endorsement of Crawford's material gave it an audience that dwarfed anything a British magazine could have provided, and it placed the private details of the Windsor household, the nursery routines, the family meals, the king's temperament, the girls' personalities, in front of a readership that had no cultural investment in the British code of royal discretion. Americans did not understand why anyone would object to a warm memoir by a beloved governess. They did not share the instinct, bred into the British establishment over generations, that proximity to the crown created obligations of silence that outweighed any personal desire for expression. They simply read the stories and found them charming. That transatlantic mismatch between British horror and American delight would define the crisis and would make Crawford's position impossible because she was being celebrated in one country and condemned in another for the same act. The publication crossed the Atlantic in the way that such things did in 1950, not instantly, but inevitably. British newspapers picked up the story within days. Excerpts were quoted, headlines were written. The palace, which had known about the manuscript since the previous autumn and had spent months hoping that the situation might be contained through private displeasure and social pressure, now faced a reality it could not manage through private channels. Crawford's account was in print. It was being read by millions. It was being discussed not just in London drawing rooms, but in American living rooms, on British high streets, in every newspaper that understood that a royal scandal, even a scandal built on affection rather than malice, sold copies. And it was being discussed not as a breach of protocol, but as a delightful window into the childhood of the beloved princesses. The disconnect between how the public experienced the material and how the palace experienced it was total, and that disconnect was itself a kind of indictment. The family's fury looked from the outside like an overreaction to a loving tribute. From the inside, it was anything but. A British serialization deal followed with remarkable speed, and its terms amplified the crisis in ways that the American publication alone could not have. Woman's Own, one of the country's most widely read weekly magazines, a publication found in hairdressers' waiting rooms, on kitchen tables, and in the handbags of millions of British women, secured the rights for a reported £30,000. That sum needs to be understood in context. £30,000 in 1950 was not merely comfortable, it was transformative. It was roughly equivalent to what a senior professional might earn in a decade of work. It was the kind of money that could buy a substantial house outright, fund a comfortable retirement, and provide security for decades. For Crawford and Buthley, it represented a financial transformation that placed them overnight in a different economic category from the one they had occupied on Crawford's palace pension. The figure matters, and it matters enormously, because it shaped how every party in the story interpreted Crawford's motives from that moment forward. To Crawford, the money may have felt like belated compensation for 17 years of deferred life, years in which she had earned a governess's wages while her contemporaries built careers, married, had families, and accumulated the savings that would sustain them through middle and old age. To Buthley, it may have felt like vindication of a practical insight that the memories were worth money and that refusing to monetize them was a form of self denial that benefited only the family that had discarded them. To the palace, the £30,000 felt like something else entirely. It felt like the price at which a trusted servant had sold the family's privacy, and the fact that the price was high made the betrayal worse, not better, because it suggested calculation rather than naivety, commercial intent rather than innocent affection. A governess who had published out of sentiment might conceivably have been forgiven. A governess who had published for £30,000 could not be, because the money made the transaction visible, made it quantifiable, and made it impossible to interpret as anything other than what the palace believed it was: the sale of the royal children's childhood to the highest bidder. The book followed later that year. The Little Princesses, published under Crawford's name, gathered the magazine material into a single volume and expanded it with additional detail. More anecdotes, more domestic scenes, more of the specific granular observation that only someone who had spent 17 years inside the household could provide. It was, by any literary standard, a modest work. Anecdotal, affectionate, written in the straightforward prose of a woman who was a teacher rather than a writer, who described what she had seen with the clarity of someone accustomed to explaining things to children. It described the princess's childhood with warmth and specificity, the games they played, the lessons they resisted, the small rebellions that Margaret mounted and Elizabeth managed. It described the king's moods with the gentle frankness of someone who had observed them daily and who understood them as symptoms of pressure rather than flaws of character. It described the queen consort's management of the household with admiration that seemed genuine. Crawford clearly respected the woman who would later engineer her destruction. It described Crawford's own role with a modesty that was probably real and certainly insufficient to protect her from the consequences of having spoken at all. The book was not an exposé. It was not a tell-all in the modern sense. It contained no scandals, no accusations, no revelations that would have damaged the family in any material way. There were no descriptions of marital discord, no allegations of cruelty, no disclosure of state secrets or political maneuvering. What it contained was intimacy, the daily accumulated specific intimacy of a woman who had been present for the bath times and the bedtimes, the tears and the tantrums, the small moments of joy and frustration that make up a childhood. And intimacy in the House of Windsor was the one commodity that could never be permitted to enter the marketplace, because once it was there, it could not be controlled. And control was everything. The public response was immediate and enthusiastic. The Little Princesses became a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic. Readers who had grown up watching Elizabeth and Margaret in newsreels and photographs now had access to the private versions of those figures, the real children behind the waving princesses, described by the woman who had known them best. The book satisfied a hunger that the palace had always known existed, but had always believed it could manage. The public's desire to know the royal family not as symbols, but as people, not as figures on a balcony, but as individuals with habits, preferences, fears, and flaws. Crawford had proved that the desire could be met. She had also proved that meeting it was possible from below, that a servant, not a courtier or a biographer, authorized by the palace, could open the door to the private world of the monarchy and invite the public inside. That was the precedent the institution feared more than any specific detail in the book, and that was the precedent Crawford had now established irrevocably in best-selling print. The broadsheet press, however, took a different view, and the press reaction matters because it sealed Crawford's fate in a way that the palace's private fury alone could not have. The British newspaper establishment, which in 1950 still operated with a degree of deference toward the monarchy that would seem remarkable by later standards, turned on Crawford with a savagery that went far beyond editorial disapproval. Columnists who might have praised the same material if it had appeared in an authorized biography condemned it as a betrayal of trust, so fundamental that it disqualified Crawford from respectable society. The word that attached itself to her, disloyal, carried a weight in post-war Britain that is difficult to recapture now. Loyalty was not merely a social virtue in 1950. It was, in the aftermath of a war that had demanded collective sacrifice on an unprecedented scale, something close to a moral absolute. The nation had endured the Blitz. The royal family had endured it alongside them. The compact between crown and country had been forged in bombing raids and rationing, and the shared understanding that duty came before desire, and disloyalty particularly disloyalty from someone who had been trusted with the most intimate details of the royal household, who had been inside the fortress while the nation defended it, was treated as a character deficiency so profound that it overrode every other consideration. It did not matter that Crawford's material was affectionate. It did not matter that it contained nothing damaging. It did not matter that it made the princesses more beloved rather than less. She had broken the code. The content of what she had said was irrelevant. The act of saying it was the entire offense. The editorial consensus hardened quickly. Crawford was cast, in the language of the broadsheets, as a woman who had sold the royal children. Not literally, but in the metaphorical sense that her commercial arrangement with the Goulds had placed a price on the princess's childhood, and that the price had been paid in American dollars, which made it worse because it suggested not merely disloyalty, but a willingness to sell British privacy to foreign appetites. The language was not always this explicit, but the implication was consistent. Crawford had committed a class transgression as much as a personal one. She had been a servant, servants did not speak. That she had spoken well, with warmth and accuracy, was irrelevant. The speaking itself was the violation. There is something about the British reaction that needs to be understood on its own terms, because it illuminates the social world Crawford had operated in and the social world that was now expelling her. In 1950, the relationship between the British public and the monarchy was not the semi-ironic, tabloid-mediated arrangement it would later become. It was closer to a compact of mutual restraint, an unwritten agreement between the crown and the people in which both sides understood the boundaries. The public loved the royal family. The royal family performed for the public. It waved from balconies, visited hospitals, opened buildings, appeared at Trooping the Colour and the state opening of Parliament. But the boundary between what was performed and what was private was understood by both sides to be inviolable. Servants knew things, courtiers knew things, dressers, valets, footmen, governesses, they all knew things, and they did not speak. That was the arrangement. It was unwritten. It was enforced not by law, but by social pressure, by the understanding that speaking would mean exclusion from the world that had given you access, and by the deeper, more fundamental understanding that the monarchy's survival depended on the maintenance of mystery. That the gap between what the public saw and what actually happened inside the palace was not a flaw in the system, but the system itself. Crawford had not merely spoken. She had demonstrated in best-selling print that the gap could be closed, and closed by anyone with sufficient access and sufficient willingness to describe what they had seen. The palace's fury was now operating on two levels simultaneously, and the distinction between them matters because it explains the comprehensiveness of the response. There was the personal fury of the Queen Consort, who experienced the book as an intimate betrayal by someone she had welcomed into her home, trusted with her children, and treated with a generosity she believed had earned permanent gratitude and permanent silence. And there was the institutional fury of the palace apparatus, the courtiers, the private secretaries, the officials who managed the invisible machinery of the crown, which saw in Crawford's publication not a personal betrayal, but a structural threat to the system of discretion that had protected the monarchy since the Windsor rebranding of 1917. The personal fury and the institutional fury reinforced each other in ways that made the response exponentially more severe than either would have produced alone. The Queen Consort's anger gave the apparatus permission to act with full force. The apparatus's institutional logic gave the Queen Consort's anger the justification of policy. Together, they produced a response that was not merely punitive but existential. Crawford was not to be punished and then forgiven. She was to be erased. The divergence in the characters' paths was now stark and accelerating, and each trajectory needs to be followed with the specificity it deserves, because the story's power lies not in the general fact of Crawford's downfall, but in the particular ways each person she had served responded to it. Elizabeth, who had been carrying the burdens of the heir since childhood and who would become queen within 2 years when her father died in February 1952, was moving inexorably toward the sovereign life Crawford had helped prepare her for. She was 24 years old in 1950. She was a wife. She had married Philip Mountbatten, now the Duke of Edinburgh, in November 1947 in a ceremony that Crawford had watched from the guest list rather than the family pew, a distinction that already told her something about where she stood. She was a mother. Prince Charles had been born in November 1948. Princess Anne would follow in August 1950. She was performing the duties of a senior royal with the methodical competence that Crawford had observed forming in the schoolroom 15 years earlier. The same child who arranged her shoes in lines now arranging her schedule with the same exacting discipline. Her response to the publication was silence, absolute, permanent, and total. The same silence she would maintain for the rest of Crawford's life, through decades of the governess's decline and isolation, through Crawford's attempts to reach her, through the long years in Aberdeen, through Crawford's death in 1988. Elizabeth did not condemn Crawford publicly. She did not defend her. She did not send a private letter of regret or a quiet message through intermediaries. She simply ceased to acknowledge that Marion Crawford existed. The silence was more devastating than any public denunciation could have been because it carried the weight of personal history. This was not a stranger cutting off a stranger. This was a woman refusing to speak to the person who had raised her, who had taught her, comforted her, taken her on the underground, supervised her Girl Guide badges, sat with her through air raids, watched her fall in love, and doing so with the absolute conviction that the institution's needs came before any personal attachment, however deep, however earned. Crawford had taught Elizabeth many things over 17 years. She had not anticipated that the most durable of those lessons would be the capacity to close a door and never open it again. Margaret's position was different, and in some ways more painful because Margaret had never been armored by the same institutional logic that protected Elizabeth. She was 20 in 1950, emerging into public life as a young woman of striking beauty, sharp wit, and a restlessness that the palace did not yet know how to manage. She was beginning to attract the kind of press attention that would define and constrain her adult life, the photographers, the columnists, the fascination with a princess who was glamorous and modern in ways the institution was not. Her relationship with Crawford had been warmer, less guarded, less mediated by awareness of future duty than Elizabeth's. She had loved Crawfie with the uncomplicated directness of a younger child who did not carry the weight of future sovereignty, and who had therefore been free in the nursery to simply enjoy the woman who cared for her. But Margaret was a Windsor, and being a Windsor meant that the family's collective judgment overrode individual feeling. The family had decided that Crawford was to be cut off. Margaret complied. Whether she wanted to, whether she grieved the loss, whether she argued privately for a different approach, none of this is documented with certainty. What is documented is the result. Margaret, too, fell silent. The spare followed the heir, as spares in the House of Windsor always did. The sister who had once climbed into Crawford's lap followed the sister who had learned to keep her distance, and Crawford lost both of them at once. The Queen Consort's hardening was the most consequential development in the crisis, because it was her will that drove the palace's response more than any other single force. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had always been a woman of remarkable duality, warmth and steel, charm and resolve, the ability to make anyone feel welcomed, and the ability to make anyone understand, without a word being spoken, that they had crossed a line. The publication of The Little Princesses burned away the warmth. What remained was the steel. She did not merely cut Crawford off personally. She established, through the force of her personality, her position, and the social power that the Queen Consort wielded within the British establishment. That anyone who maintained contact with Crawford was making a choice, and that the choice would be noted. The social quarantine was comprehensive. Former colleagues in the palace, members of the household staff who had known Crawford during her years of service, the wider network of relationships that accrues to anyone who has spent nearly 2 decades inside a prestigious institution, all of it was subject to the Queen Consort's displeasure, and her displeasure was not something that anyone with a career or a social position in proximity to the crown could afford to ignore. Crawford was not merely cut off, she was made radioactive. Contact with her became a form of disloyalty by association. George Thiags occupied a quieter, sadder position in the unfolding crisis. His health was deteriorating. The lung cancer that would kill him in February 1952 was not yet diagnosed, but the symptoms were accumulating in ways that those closest to him could see, even if the public could not. He was coughing more, he was losing weight, he was tiring more easily. The man who had never wanted the crown was being worn down by it in ways that went beyond the symbolic, and the physical decline lent a particular poignancy to his position in the Crawford affair, because he had been the king who had made the household feel genuinely familial. He had been the father who rough-housed with the girls in the nursery. He had been the employer whose gnashes were forgiven because they came from a man under pressure rather than a man of cruelty. He had given Crawford the cottage, the honor, the pension. He had been, in his way, the person most responsible for making Crawford believe that her 17 years of service had earned her something permanent. He was 54 years old in 1950. He was tired. He was ill. He had spent 14 years carrying a crown he had never sought, and the cost was written in his body, the gauntness, the cough, the weariness that no amount of rest could relieve. Whether the Crawford affair occupied much of his attention amid these larger concerns is doubtful. The affairs of a retired governess in an American magazine would have seemed, from the perspective of a man managing a post-war nation and a deteriorating body, relatively minor. But it was not minor for Crawford, and it was not minor for the household. And his silence on the matter, his failure or refusal to moderate his wife's response, to intervene on behalf of a woman who had served his family loyally for nearly 2 decades, was itself a kind of verdict. He would be dead within 2 years. The governess who had helped raise his daughters would outlive him by 36 years, spending every one of those years outside the world he had once welcomed her into. George Butler had achieved what the palace believed he had wanted all along: commercial success based on his wife's royal connection. The £30,000 from Woman's Own, the royalties from the book, the American magazine payments, these represented a financial transformation that placed the Buthleys in a position of material comfort that Crawford's pension alone could never have provided. Whether Buthley felt triumph, satisfaction, or the first stirrings of unease at what the success was costing his wife, in every non-financial dimension, is not something the sources reveal with certainty. Later accounts paint him as satisfied, or at least pragmatic, a man who had calculated correctly that the memories were worth money and who was content with the transaction. But the transaction was not merely financial, it was existential. Crawford had traded her place in the only world she had ever really belonged to for £30,000 on a byline, and the exchange was irreversible. The Goulds in New York had their sensation. The Ladies' Home Journal had delivered to its readers exactly what it had promised: warmth, intimacy, the private lives of the world's most famous princesses, told by the woman who knew them best. From the editor's perspective, the project was an unqualified triumph. The controversy in Britain only amplified American interest. The pearl clutching of the British establishment, the editorial condemnations, the whispered social disapproval, the palace's visible fury was, from the vantage point of a Manhattan magazine office, free publicity of the most valuable kind. The Goulds understood the American appetite for royal content in a way the palace never would and never wanted to. Americans did not share the British compact of mutual restraint. They wanted to know. They wanted intimacy. They wanted the human beings behind the crowns. Crawford had given them exactly that, and the Goulds had facilitated the exchange, and they would face no consequences for it. The consequences were Crawford's alone to bear, and she would bear them for the rest of her life. But success, in Crawford's case, was not survival. It was the opposite. Every copy of The Little Princesses that sold, every reader who smiled at the anecdote about Margaret's mischief or Elizabeth's shoe arranging, every American housewife who felt closer to the royal family because of Crawford's words, each one tightened the noose around the woman who had written them. Because the more the public liked the book, the less possible it became for the Windsors to forgive her. Forgiveness would mean accepting that a servant could publish intimate details about the family and face no lasting consequences. It would mean accepting that the affection of the public earned through disclosure was more powerful than the discipline of the institution. It would mean accepting that the code born in 1917, reinforced by the abdication, maintained through the war, enforced by the Queen Consort with absolute conviction, was not absolute after all. The palace could not afford that conclusion. The institution was built on the premise that its private life was its own. Crawford had proved the premise was vulnerable, and dangerously so, and for the premise to be restored, Crawford had to be made an example. There is a particular cruelty in the logic, and it deserves to be named. Crawford had written a book that was warm, affectionate, and admiring. It contained no scandals, no accusations, no damaging revelations. It made the princesses more beloved, not less. It made the monarchy more human, not less. It was, by any objective measure, a gift to the institution's public image. And it was, by the institution's own reckoning, an unforgivable act, not because of what it said, but because of what it demonstrated. It demonstrated that the most intimate knowledge of the royal family could be narrated from below by a woman without title or protection, and that the public would embrace the narration more warmly than any palace-authorized account could hope to be embraced. The warmth was the weapon, the affection was the threat, And the response? The response that was already taking shape in the private corridors of the palace, in the calculations of courtiers, in the cold resolution of a queen consort who had decided that mercy was a luxury the institution could not afford, would be more thorough, more permanent, and more devastating than anything a gentle book about two little princesses should ever have provoked. The psychological logic of the family's response is worth understanding on its own terms, even if understanding it does not make it easier to accept. The Windsors probably experienced Crawford's book less as information leakage than as boundary collapse. She had known the girls before the public knew them. She had occupied a quasi-familial role, and not by blood, not by title, not by any formal recognition, but by proximity, by daily presence, by the accumulated intimacy of 17 years. She had been given access to the inner life of the family on the implicit understanding that the access was a privilege, not a right, and that the privilege could not be converted into authorship. When she converted it anyway, the family experienced something closer to violation than to inconvenience. She had proved that the most trusted, most intimate, most seemingly safe figures in the system still had voices of their own. She had proved that closeness was not the same as ownership, and that proof was intolerable because the entire architecture of the Windsor household rested on the assumption that it was. Crawford had published her book. The public had embraced it. The press had condemned her. The palace had closed ranks. The family had fallen silent. And the governess who had spent 17 years raising two princesses was about to discover that publication was not the punishment. Publication was only the provocation. The actual punishment, the exile, the erasure, the systematic transformation of Marion Crawford from beloved Crawfie into non-person, had not yet begun. The book was a sensation. The governess was famous, and the palace had already decided that fame, for Marion Crawford, would be the beginning of a reckoning that would consume the rest of her life. The machinery of exclusion, once set in motion, operated with a thoroughness that revealed how completely the palace apparatus could control the social world around it when it chose to. In the months following the publication of The Little Princesses, the consequences arrived not as a single dramatic event, but as a series of closures. Doors that had been open for 17 years shutting one after another, quietly, firmly, and without explanation. The telephone calls that Crawford had once received from former colleagues in the household stopped. The invitations that had once arrived, to garden parties, to informal gatherings, to the small social events that connected the palace's extended network of former and current staffs, ceased. The letters that Crawford had once exchanged with members of the household went unanswered. The silence spread outward from the queen consort's displeasure like frost across a window pane, and it covered everything it touched. The mechanism deserves to be understood because it was not crude. The palace did not issue a public denunciation. It did not release a statement condemning Crawford. It did not need to. The British establishment of 1950 ran on subtler currencies than public declarations. A word from the queen consort to a lady in waiting. A raised eyebrow from a private secretary when Crawford's name was mentioned. The quiet withdrawal of an invitation that had been expected. The failure to return a telephone call that would 6 months earlier have been answered promptly. These were the instruments of social destruction available to the palace, and they were wielded with the practiced efficiency of an institution that had been managing its own social ecology for generations. The message did not need to be spoken aloud. It only needed to be understood. And in the small, interconnected world of the court and its satellites, understanding was instantaneous. Crawford was still living in Nottingham Cottage. She was still, technically, on the Kensington Palace grounds. She was still a recipient of the Royal Victorian Order. She still had her pension. The outward markers of her connection to the institution remained in place, but the substance of that connection, the human substance, the relationships, the daily small recognitions of her place in the extended family of the household, the sense that she was known and valued and remembered, was being stripped away with a methodical efficiency that suggested not spontaneous anger, but calculated policy. The palace apparatus knew how to manage departures. It had been managing them for centuries. The removal of favorites, the quiet sidelining of courtiers who had fallen from grace, the smooth, almost invisible process by which people, who were no longer useful or who had become inconvenient, were eased out of the orbit of the crown. The management of Marion Crawford's departure was conducted with the same administrative precision the apparatus applied to everything, thoroughly, discreetly, and without leaving any official record that might later invite scrutiny or generate sympathy. The social quarantine extended well beyond the palace itself. Crawford discovered in those months that the Queen Consort's displeasure operated like a gravitational field whose pull was felt far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace or Clarence House. People who had known her during her years of service, people who might, in other circumstances, have maintained friendly contact with a retired colleague they had liked and respected, found that associating with Crawford carried risks they were not prepared to take. The court world in post-war Britain was small, interconnected, and governed by unwritten rules that everyone understood. Reputations were fragile. Careers depended on favor. Social positions depended on not being seen to sympathize with someone the Queen Consort had designated as a traitor to the household. Crawford's social circle, which had never been particularly wide, she had spent 17 years inside a household that was itself a kind of enclosed world, and the friends she had made were largely people connected to that world, contracted sharply. She was not merely losing her connection to the royal family, she was losing her connection to the only community she had ever fully belonged to, and the loss was comprehensive. Boothlay's response to the tightening exclusion appears from the accounts that mention him to have been pragmatic rather than distressed. He had the money. The book was selling well in both Britain and America. The magazine payments had been received and deposited. Whatever the social cost, and the social cost was real, though it fell more heavily on Crawford than on a man who had never been part of the court world, the financial position was secure, and Boothly was not a man whose identity had been built around proximity to the crown. He had not spent 17 years inside the household. He had not formed the attachments that Crawford had formed. He had not given his best years to other people's children. He could view the situation with a detachment that was not available to his wife, and that detachment, whether it was emotional distance, practical realism, or the simple indifference of someone who had never understood what the palace meant to the woman he had married, widened the gap between them at precisely the moment when Crawford most needed someone who could comprehend the magnitude of what she was losing. She was not losing a job. She was losing a world. And her husband, for all his practical virtues, did not appear to understand the difference. Crawford, for her part, does not appear to have fully grasped the permanence of what was happening to her, and that failure of understanding is itself a measure of how completely the household had shaped her perception of the family. The strongest accounts suggest that she continued to believe, even as the social temperature around her dropped toward freezing, that the family's anger would eventually subside. The time and distance would do what argument could not, that the warmth of 17 years would reassert itself, that the people she had known and loved and served would remember who she was and what she had given them. She had known them for 17 years. She had loved their children. She had been loyal, in her own understanding of the word, for nearly 2 decades. The idea that all of that could be cancelled by a single act of publication, an act she still believed was affectionate rather than treasonous, seems to have been genuinely incomprehensible to her. She did not understand that the palace's code of silence was not a preference, but a structural requirement, and that violating it had moved her, in the institution's eyes, from the category of person to the category of problem. Problems were not forgiven, problems were managed. And the management of Crawford was approaching its final phase. The gathering storm, the period immediately before the break became total and irreversible, can be located in the late summer and early autumn of 1950. The book had been published. The serializations had run their course. The money had been paid and received. The broadsheets had delivered their verdicts. The palace had communicated its displeasure through every available channel, social, administrative, personal, and Crawford was still in Nottingham Cottage, still on the grounds of Kensington Palace, still occupying the grace-and-favour residence that the king had given her and that the Queen Consort now regarded as an affront. A daily physical reminder that the woman who had violated the code was living inside the perimeter of the institution she had offended, breathing the same air, walking the same paths, visible from the same windows that looked out over the palace grounds. The position was untenable, and both sides knew it. Crawford could not stay in a cottage granted by the grace of a family that had withdrawn its grace. The palace could not tolerate the presence of a woman it had designated as disloyal on grounds it controlled. The resolution was inevitable, and the only question was whether it would be enacted through a formal request, an informal communication, or the simple suffocating pressure of social exclusion, sustained long enough that the occupant chose to leave on her own terms. The palace characteristically appears to have chosen the third option. There is no record of a formal eviction notice. There is no record of a letter demanding Crawford's departure. There is instead the deadened, administrative intimacy of an institution that understood how to make a person feel unwelcome without ever committing anything to paper that might later be examined. There is something about Nottingham Cottage in those final weeks that is worth trying to see clearly, because it is the setting of the story's central devastation, and because the physical details are what make the emotional reality legible. The cottage was small by palace standards, a modest, unpretentious residence within the Kensington Palace complex, the kind of property that the Crown allocated to retired servants and minor officials as a gesture of gratitude and an instrument of retention. It had been furnished, in part, with pieces that Queen Mary had helped select: tables, chairs, perhaps curtains or china. The precise items lost to the record, but the gesture itself well attested. An act of royal generosity that now carried a different meaning, because every piece of furniture in the cottage was a reminder that Crawford's home was not her own. The chairs were the Crown's chairs. The tables were the Crown's tables. The path that led from the front door to the palace grounds was the Crown's path. Crawford owned nothing in it except her memories and her books and the proofs and clippings from the publications that had caused the crisis. She was living inside a physical metaphor for her entire relationship with the family, surrounded by their property, dependent on their goodwill, and discovering that the goodwill had been conditional all along. Inside the cottage, in those late summer and early autumn weeks, Crawford was surrounded by the evidence of a life built on proximity and now being dismantled by withdrawal. The books she had accumulated during her years of service, the photographs, if she had kept them, of the girls at various ages in various settings, the visual record of 17 years compressed into albums and frames, the Royal Victorian Order Medal, awarded in recognition of personal service to the sovereign, which she still held and which the palace had not, perhaps could not, revoke. The medal must have felt in those final weeks like a particularly pointed irony, an honor given for loyalty by a family that no longer wished to acknowledge that the loyalty had existed, a physical object certifying a relationship that the institution had decided to deny. The details of Crawford's final days in Nottingham Cottage are not documented with the precision that a historian or a scriptwriter might wish for. The strongest accounts say that she left the cottage in the autumn of 1950. They say she went to Scotland. They say she was ostracized and close to breakdown. They do not provide an exact date. They do not describe a specific confrontation or a single moment of expulsion. And that absence of specificity is itself part of the story's meaning, because it tells you something essential about how the palace operated and how it understood the exercise of power. There was no dramatic scene. There was no confrontation in a drawing room. There was no letter of dismissal delivered by a liveried footman. There was instead the accumulated weight of silence, the unanswered calls, the unacknowledged letters, the social freeze, the dawning understanding that the cottage was no longer a home, but a holding pen, and that the family Crawford had served for 17 years was waiting, with the infinite institutional patience of a dynasty that had been managing inconvenient people for centuries, for her to leave. The central tragedy of Marion Crawford's story is not the publication of The Little Princesses. The book was the catalyst. The tragedy is what happened after. The exile that began in the autumn of 1950 and lasted without interruption, without reprieve, without a single moment of reconciliation for the remaining 38 years of her life. She left Nottingham Cottage. The precise circumstances are blurred by the kind of discreet institutional erasure at which the palace excelled. No public announcement, no press release, no official statement, nothing that would create a record or invite questions. What is known is this: by the autumn of 1950, Crawford was gone from Kensington Palace. The grace-and-favour residence that had been her reward for 17 years of service was no longer hers. The grounds she had walked every day during her years of service, the buildings she had worked in, the gardens where the princesses had played under her supervision, the corridors she had navigated with the confidence of someone who belonged, all of it was behind her. She went to Scotland. She went to Aberdeen, to a city far from London and far from the palace and far from everything that had defined her adult life. She was 41 years old. That age is worth pausing over because it grounds the story in physical reality and strips away any temptation to treat Crawford's fate as an abstraction. She was 41. She had entered the York household at 22 or 23, a young woman fresh from teacher training with her career ahead of her. She had left royal service at 38 or 39, Having spent the years in which most women of her generation married, had children, built homes, and established the networks of friendship and community that would sustain them through middle age inside a household that had absorbed her completely and then expelled her. She had spent less than 3 years as a private citizen, 3 years in Nottingham Cottage, 3 years of adjustment and marriage, and the gradual discovery that the world outside the palace was less hospitable than the world inside it, before the publication and its consequences overtook her. And now she was 41, living in Aberdeen, cut off from every person who had mattered to her during the formative decades of her adult life. She had no children. The 17 years she had given to other people's children had left no time for her own, and by 1950 the window was closing. She had a husband, George Buthley, whose relationship to her inner world was partial at best, a man who understood the financial dimensions of her situation with clarity and the emotional dimensions with something less than that. She had money from the book and the serializations, but money, as the palace understood intuitively and as Crawford was now learning through experience, couldn't purchase the thing she had lost. What she had lost was not income. It was not status, though she had lost that too. What she had lost was belonging, the daily taken for granted knowledge that she was part of something, that she was known, that her presence was expected and her absence would be felt. What she had lost was the right to be remembered with warmth by the people she had helped raise. What she had lost was 17 years of emotional investment, erased as though the investment had never been made. No member of the royal family spoke to her again. That sentence is simple enough to write. It takes less than 2 seconds to read aloud. It is almost impossible to absorb in its full meaning. No member of the royal family spoke to Marion Crawford again after the autumn of 1950. Not once, not ever, not in 38 years. Not Elizabeth, who became queen in February 1952 and who ruled for 70 years and who owed a significant portion of her formation, her discipline, her sense of duty, her capacity for self-containment, her understanding of what it meant to carry a role larger than any individual personality, to the woman she now refused to acknowledge. Crawford had taught Elizabeth to read. She had taught her history and geography and arithmetic. She had taken her to Woolworths and on the underground and to Girl Guide meetings. She had sat with her through air raids. She had watched her fall in love. And Elizabeth, as queen, as the embodiment of the institution Crawford had served, never spoke to her again, never wrote to her, never sent a message through an intermediary, never acknowledged in any public or private way that Crawford's years of service had meant anything at all. Not Margaret, who had loved Crawfie with an openness and directness that the institution had never quite managed to train out of her, and who complied with the family's verdict despite whatever private grief that compliance cost her. Margaret's silence is in some ways the hardest to reconcile with what is known about her temperament. She was not a woman who submitted easily to rules she found unjust. She was not a woman who suppressed her emotions to satisfy institutional demands. She would later push against the palace's boundaries in ways that generated their own crises. The Townsend affair, the complicated marriages, the public struggles, that made her one of the most sympathetic and most constrained figures in the modern monarchy. But on the matter of Crawford, she held the line. The family had spoken, Margaret obeyed, and the governess who had been closer to her emotionally than almost anyone outside her immediate family was left outside permanently without appeal. Not the queen consort, who had set the terms of the exclusion and who maintained those terms with an absolutism that never wavered. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon lived until 2002. She died at the age of 101. In the 52 years between Crawford's departure from Nottingham Cottage and the Queen Mother's death, there was no softening, no private relenting, no quiet acknowledgement that the punishment might have been disproportionate. The woman who had once described Crawford as part of the household's intimate circle maintained, for more than half a century, that Crawford had committed an offense so grave that it could never be forgiven. The Queen Mother's longevity makes the severity of the exclusion almost impossible to overstate. She outlived Crawford by 14 years and spent every one of those years maintaining the same position she had taken in 1950. Not George VI, who died in February 1952, less than 18 months after Crawford's departure from Nottingham Cottage. He did not use those 18 months to send a note, a word, a quiet signal of acknowledgement. Whether he wanted to and was prevented by his wife's position, whether he agreed with the exclusion, whether the declining state of his health left him without the energy or attention for such matters, is not known. What is known is the silence. The king who had given Crawford the cottage and the medal and the pension, the king whose household she had helped sustain for 17 years, died without making any recorded attempt to moderate the punishment his family had imposed on the woman who had raised his daughters. The completeness of the severance is the thing that demands attention, because it is the thing that distinguishes Crawford's punishment from ordinary estrangement. People fall out with families, employees are dismissed, relationships end, sometimes bitterly, sometimes with lingering resentment that lasts for years. But the Windsor exclusion of Crawford was not an ordinary falling out. It was not an argument that escalated, a misunderstanding that hardened, a wound that might have healed with time and distance. It was systematic, it was permanent, it was enforced not by one person's anger, but by the collective will of an institution that had decided, as a matter of policy, that Crawford's existence was to be treated as though it had not happened. She was not merely unforgiven, she was unremembered, not in the sense that people literally forgot her, because they did not, but in the sense that the institution refused to grant her memory any official place in its narrative. She had been there. She had served faithfully for 17 years. She had shaped the daily lives of two princesses who became among the most important women of the 20th century. And the family's response was to behave as though none of it had counted, as though the years and the devotion and the affection had been a clerical error that could be corrected by refusing to speak of it. The asymmetry of the outcome is where the story's emotional weight concentrates, and it needs to be felt in full. The children Crawford had helped educate went on into history. Elizabeth became queen on the 6th of February 1952, at the age of 25. She presided over the transformation of the British Empire into the Commonwealth. She navigated constitutional crises, political upheavals, personal scandals, and the relentless modernization of public life with the discipline and self-possession that Crawford had helped instill. The same capacity for emotional containment that the governess had observed forming in the schoolroom and that now governed the most prominent public life in the world. Margaret became one of the most photographed, most discussed, most constrained women of her generation, glamorous, intelligent, trapped by the institution in ways that would generate their own tragedies and their own sympathies. Both sisters lived public lives of extraordinary visibility, surrounded by people, by staff, by the attention of millions. Neither acknowledged, publicly or privately, the woman who had been for 17 years the most constant adult presence in their daily lives outside their parents. Crawford, meanwhile, was in Aberdeen. She had been pushed outside the story. The woman who had helped make the Windsor domestic image livable for children, who had taken them to Woolworths, ridden the tube with them, managed their wartime fears, organized their guide troop, supervised their homework, watched them grow from small girls in the nursery of Piccadilly into young women preparing for lives of public duty, was living in a Scottish city where nobody knew her as anything other than the governess who had been discarded by the royal family. The identity that had defined her for her entire adult life, Crawfie, the beloved, the trusted, the indispensable, had been confiscated by the institution that had bestowed it. What remained was Mrs. Buthley, a woman in her early 40s, in Aberdeen, with a husband and a pension and a best-selling book and a medal she could not wear and a past she could not claim and no world left to belong to. The immediate aftermath of the exile settled into a pattern that would define the rest of Crawford's life. Isolation, the absence of reconciliation, and the gradual erosion of the public sympathy that the book had initially generated. In the weeks and months after leaving Nottingham Cottage, Crawford appears to have held onto the belief, or the hope, or perhaps only the inability to accept the alternative, that the break was not permanent, that the family would relent, that 17 years of devoted service counted for something that could not be permanently cancelled by one act of publication. That belief, if it existed, was sustained by nothing except Crawford's own refusal to accept the evidence accumulating around her. No message came from the palace. No intermediary reached out. No quiet signal was sent through the social networks that connected the court world to the wider British establishment. The silence was total, and it remained total. And with every passing week and month, it became harder to interpret as anything other than what it was. A sentence without an expiry date, imposed by an institution that did not forgive, because forgiveness would establish a precedent, and precedent was the thing the institution feared above all else. The practical dimensions of Crawford's new life in Aberdeen were a sharp contrast to the world she had left. She and Buthley settled into a domestic routine that bore no resemblance to the palace life she had known. There were no footmen, no household schedules, no royal engagements to prepare for, no princesses to teach. There was instead the ordinary fabric of a middle-class Scottish marriage, housekeeping, meals, the daily management of a life that had no external structure beyond what Crawford and Buckley imposed on it themselves. For a woman who had spent 17 years inside one of the most structured environments in the world, where every hour had its purpose and every day had its rhythm and every role had its clear, unambiguous function, the absence of structure must have been disorienting. She was a teacher without students, a governess without a household, a woman whose professional identity had been so completely absorbed by the institution she served that when the institution withdrew, the identity collapsed with it. Crawford still had her pen. She still had the Gould's interest. She still had the public's residual curiosity about the royal family, and she still had the practical need to earn money because the Nottingham cottage was gone and the life she had imagined building inside the palace's orbit had been destroyed. And whatever the book had earned, it would not last forever. So she did. The only thing she knew how to do was the only asset she had left. She kept writing. She took on a regular column for Woman's Own, providing commentary and observation on royal events for a readership that was willing to treat her as an authority. She began work on follow-up books, shorter, less substantial works about Queen Mary, about Queen Elizabeth II, about Princess Margaret, trying to build a career on the foundation of her 17 years of insider knowledge. It was a logical strategy. It was also a fatal one, because every word she published after The Little Princesses confirmed the palace's judgment that she was incorrigible, that the violation was not a single lapse but an ongoing pattern, and that the punishment was justified. But the writing career that Crawford attempted to construct in the early 1950s was itself precarious, because it depended on a resource that was finite and depreciating with every passing year. Her first-hand knowledge of the royal household. She had left service in 1947. By 1952, her direct experience was 5 years out of date. By 1955, it would be 8 years out of date. The princesses she had known were growing into women she did not know. The household she had described was evolving in ways she could not observe from Aberdeen. The political and social landscape of the monarchy was shifting. Television was transforming the relationship between the crown and the public. The new queen was establishing her own style of sovereignty. The world Crawford had inhabited was becoming historical rather than current. She was a woman trying to sell currency that was losing value with every passing season. And the moment that currency finally ran out, the moment she could no longer write from genuine knowledge and had to rely instead on inference, guesswork, or the reheating of old material, the career would collapse. And the collapse would be public, and it would be humiliating. That collapse was coming. It would arrive on a specific date, in a specific issue of a specific magazine, and it would strip from Crawford the last thing the palace had not yet taken. Not her connection to the family, which was already gone, not her social position, which was already destroyed, but her credibility with the public that had once embraced her words as intimate truth. The exile from the palace had taken her world. What came next would take her dignity, and after that there would be nothing left to take except the years themselves. The collapse came on the 16th of June 1955, and it arrived not as a grand catastrophe, but as a small, humiliating error that exposed with brutal clarity how far Crawford had drifted from the world she claimed to know. Her column in Woman's Own for that week described, in the confident insider prose that her readers had come to expect, the spectacle of trooping the color and the pageantry of Royal Ascot, the queen in the carriage, the horses on parade, the hats and the crowds and the rituals that marked the English summer season. The descriptions were vivid. The tone was assured. The details were specific enough to suggest the authority of someone who was there, or at least who knew people who were. And both events had been cancelled. A national rail strike had forced the postponement of Trooping the Colour and disrupted Royal Ascot, and Crawford, writing from Aberdeen, hundreds of miles from London and further still from the world of the palace, had not known. She had described events that had not happened, in confident and specific prose, for a national readership. She had filed copy about royal occasions she had not attended, and that had not taken place, and the magazine had published it. And the discrepancy had been discovered not by the editorial staff, but by readers who knew, because they read newspapers, what Crawford apparently did not. And whatever credibility Crawford had retained as a commentator on the royal family, whatever residual authority her 17 years of service had lent to her byline, was destroyed in a single issue of a weekly magazine. The incident was devastating not merely because it was embarrassing, though the embarrassment was acute, but because of what it revealed about the completeness of Crawford's isolation. She was not in London. She had not been in London for 5 years. She was not in contact with anyone inside or near the palace, not a single source, not a single informant, not a single former colleague willing to pick up the telephone and relay basic information about public events. She had no friends in the household who might have called to say that Trooping the Colour had been postponed and Ascot disrupted. She was writing about the royal family from a position of total disconnection, producing copy that was indistinguishable from imagination because it was, in the most literal sense, imagined. A description of events that existed only in her memory, of how such occasion normally proceeded, applied to a week in which the normal had been overridden by a rail strike she had not bothered or been able to verify. The governess who had once known what Elizabeth ate for breakfast, who had sat in on the princess's constitutional history lessons, who had been present for the private life of the monarchy for nearly 2 decades, was now guessing about events that had been reported in every newspaper in the country. The distance between the woman who had ridden the underground with the future queen in 1939 and the woman who described the cancelled parade as though it had taken place in 1955 was the precise measurement of everything she had lost. The fallout was swift and final. The woman's own column ended. Crawford's career as a royal commentator, the only career available to her, the only use she had found for the knowledge and the name recognition that the publication of The Little Princesses had given her, was finished. The follow-up books she had published in the intervening years, the works on Queen Mary, on Elizabeth II, and on Princess Margaret, had sold modestly at best, each one thinner and less authoritative than the last, each one a diminished echo of the first book's intimate specificity. The market for Crawford's insider knowledge had been sustained by the illusion that she remained, in some sense, connected to the world she described. The woman's own debacle shattered that illusion publicly and permanently. With the column gone and the books exhausted and her reputation as a reliable commentator destroyed, Crawford had nothing left to sell. The asset she had traded her world for. Her first-hand knowledge of the royal family, the 17 years of accumulated intimacy that had once made her the only person in the world who could write what she had written, was spent. The currency had been devalued to nothing by time, distance, and a rail strike. She was 46 years old. She had been exiled for 5 years. She had more than 30 years still to live. And the question that would define those remaining decades was already taking shape, though Crawford may not yet have understood it in those terms. What happens to a person when the role that gave them meaning has been permanently removed? When the community that gave them belonging has permanently expelled them? And when the one thing they tried to build from the wreckage has collapsed in public? The answer, in Crawford's case, was retreat. Slow, comprehensive, and eventually total. She withdrew from public life. She stopped writing. She stopped, as far as the available record shows, making any further attempt to re-establish contact with the royal family or to maintain a presence in the world of royal commentary. The hope that the breach might heal, the hope she appears to have carried through the early 1950s, sustained by nothing but her own refusal to accept the evidence accumulating around her, was gone. What replaced it was something quieter and more corrosive. The understanding that the silence was permanent, that the family would never relent, and that she would spend the rest of her life defined by a single decision made in her late 30s and its consequences. Aberdeen became her world, and its boundaries contracted year by year. The city that had been a retreat became a terminus. She and Buthley lived quietly, without public profile, without connection to the court world that had once defined her existence, without the social networks that most people her age had spent decades cultivating. There were no more magazine columns to write, no more books to publish, no more public identity to maintain. The years accumulated in the way that years do when nothing happens, not with the dramatic punctuation of events, but with the slow, grinding accumulation of days in which the most significant thing that occurred was the absence of the things that had once given those days meaning. The 1950s became the 60s. The 60s became the 70s. Britain changed around Crawford in ways that she could observe but not participate in. The end of rationing, the rise of television, the cultural revolution of the 60s, the economic turbulence of the 70s, the transformation of the country from a fading imperial power into something newer and less certain. She remained in Aberdeen through all of it, a fixed point in a changing landscape, defined by a punishment that had been imposed in 1950 and that showed no sign of expiring. Television, more than anything else, must have made the exile excruciating, because television brought the royal family into Crawford's sitting room in a way that no other medium could. She could watch the Queen's Christmas broadcast and see the face of the girl she had taught to read. She could watch news coverage of state occasions and see the woman she had taken on the underground presiding over the rituals of the crown with the composure that Crawford had helped form. She could watch Margaret on screen, glamorous, constrained, visibly struggling with the limitations of her role, and remember the child who had climbed into her lap and refused to behave and made faces through banisters. The television showed Crawford the lives she had helped shape, proceeding without her year after year in a public that she could see but could not reach. It was, in its way, the most refined form of exclusion the modern age could produce, not absence, but enforced spectatorship. She could watch, she could not participate, she could not respond. She could not even send a letter that would be acknowledged. Elizabeth II's reign continued, decade after decade, the serious child Crawford had known, becoming the most recognizable sovereign in the world. Her face on every coin and every stamp, her image in every newspaper, her Christmas message and annual ritual that connected the monarchy to millions of households. Elizabeth navigated the Suez Crisis of 1956, the decolonization of Africa, the constitutional evolution of the Commonwealth, the growing intrusiveness of the media, the personal crises that would multiply in later decades, her children's troubled marriages, the fire at Windsor Castle, the death of Diana, with the discipline and self-containment that were her defining characteristics and that Crawford had watched forming in the schoolroom at Buckingham Palace 40 years earlier. Margaret's life unfolded in ways Crawford could only follow from a distance, through newspapers and television and the public narrative that bore no resemblance to the private Margaret she had known in the nursery. The Townsend affair, Margaret's love for the divorce group captain Peter Townsend, a crisis that the palace managed with the same insistence on institutional priorities over personal feeling that had governed Crawford's own punishment, played out in the press during the mid-1950s. Margaret chose duty over love, renouncing Townsend in a public statement on the 31st of October, 1955, declaring that she had been mindful of the Church's teaching, that Christian marriage is indissoluble. Crawford, watching from Aberdeen, must have recognized something in the pattern. Another woman inside the Windsor system, being asked to sacrifice personal desire for institutional necessity. Another individual being consumed by the code. Margaret's marriage to the photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, the birth of their two children, the subsequent divorce in 1978, and her gradual withdrawal from the vivid, glamorous public life she had once inhabited. Crawford watched it all from outside, without the ability to offer comfort or perspective or the simple acknowledgement that she understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to be shaped and then abandoned by the institution that had claimed to value you. But the Queen Mother remained a fixture of national affection throughout these decades, the most popular member of the royal family by most measures, celebrated for her warmth, her resilience, her apparent ability to enjoy life, with an enthusiasm that defied both age and circumstance. In private, she remained unyielding on the matter of Crawford. The years did not soften her position. The passage of decades in the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s did not produce the mellowing that Crawford might once have hoped for. The woman who had described Crawford as having gone off her head in 1949 maintained that assessment effectively for the remaining 53 years of her life. The Queen Mother's refusal to acknowledge her former governess lasted longer than most marriages, longer than most careers, longer than most feuds that anyone could name. It was a masterclass in institutional discipline, sustained across more than half a century without a single documented moment of doubt or regret. George Buthley died in 1977. Crawford was 68 years old. The man who had been her husband for 30 years, the man whose practical instincts had helped precipitate the crisis that ended her palace life, the man who had seen commercial value where Crawford had seen affection, the man who had been both her companion in exile and, in the palace's judgment, the architect of her downfall, was gone. Whatever the marriage had been in its later years, companionate, strained, habitual, sustained by proximity rather than passion, shaped by the peculiar isolation that the couple shared. His death left Crawford alone in Aberdeen in a way she had not experienced before. She was a widow approaching 70, without children, without extended family of any visible significance in the biographical record, without friends who had survived the social quarantine of 1950, without the daily presence of another human being in the house. The isolation that had been her condition since the autumn of 1950 was now, with Buckley's death, complete in every dimension: social, professional, familial, and domestic. She was, in the most literal sense, alone. The depression that followed, or that had been building for years, perhaps decades, beneath the surface of a life constructed from endurance rather than fulfillment, is documented in the biographical sources with the restraint that such matters deserve and with the specificity that honesty requires. Crawford suffered depression. The condition was not a brief episode or a manageable bout of low mood. It was a sustained, debilitating affliction that colored her final years and that led, on at least 2 occasions, to suicide attempts. Those attempts must be stated plainly, without euphemism, because they are part of the story's cost and because softening them would diminish the reality of what Crawford endured. She was a woman in her 70s and 80s, living alone in Aberdeen, cut off from every person and every institution that had given her life meaning and purpose, and the weight of that isolation, compounded by decades of unrelieved exclusion, by the knowledge that the children she had raised would never acknowledge her again, by the daily reality of growing old alone, with memories that nobody in her life wanted to hear and that the institution considered stolen property, brought her to the point where continuing seemed less bearable than stopping. She survived both attempts. She continued to live. But the life she continued to live was shaped by the absence of everything that had once made it livable. Crawford died on the 11th of February 1988 in Aberdeen. She was 78 years old. She had been exiled from the royal family for 38 years, more than twice as long as she had served them. She had outlived George VI by 36 years. She had outlived the world she had inhabited by nearly 4 decades, and the family whose emotional life she had once managed, whose children she had raised, whose private moments she had witnessed and later described with affection and care, sent no flowers to her funeral. That detail, the absence of flowers, is so stark that it barely requires commentary. It is the entire story compressed into a single omission. A bouquet of flowers would have cost the palace nothing, nothing in money, nothing in institutional capital, nothing in precedent. It would not have implied forgiveness. It would not have constituted an acknowledgement that Crawford had been right to publish. It would simply have been a recognition that a woman who had served the family for 17 years and who had died alone in Aberdeen deserved the minimal courtesy of being noticed. The palace chose not to. The Queen chose not to. The Queen Mother, who was 87 years old in 1988 and who would live for another 14 years, chose not to. Margaret, who was 57 and who had once loved Crawfie with an openness that the institution had spent 4 decades suppressing, chose not to. The absence was collective. It was deliberate. And it said, with a finality that no words could improve upon, what the institution believed Crawford deserved for breaking the code. Nothing. Not even after death. The cultural afterlife of Crawford's story began slowly and gathered force as the decades passed, and the events of 1950 receded far enough into history to be examined without the heat of contemporary scandal. For years after her death, Crawford remained what the palace had intended her to be: a cautionary tale, a name invoked as a warning to servants and staff about the consequences of speaking out of turn. In the language of the court and the British press, to do a Crawfie became shorthand for the ultimate act of household betrayal. A phrase that encoded the palace's version of the story so efficiently that it required no elaboration and permitted no ambiguity. The person who did a Crawfie was, by definition, disloyal, ungrateful, and deserving of whatever punishment the institution chose to impose. The phrase survived for decades. It was used reportedly to caution members of the household staff well into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, long after the woman it referred to had died in obscurity. The fact that it existed at all tells you something essential about the thoroughness of the palace's narrative control. Crawford had been reduced, in institutional memory, from a complex human being with legitimate claims and genuine affection to a single cautionary verb, a warning sign, a shorthand for treachery. The first significant reassessment came in the form of a television documentary, Crawfie, the royal nanny who wouldn't keep mom. Produced for Channel 4 and broadcast on the 26th of June 2000, 50 years after the publication of The Little Princesses and 12 years after Crawford's death. The documentary treated Crawford not as a traitor, but as a subject worthy of serious journalistic attention. A woman whose story raised genuine and unresolved questions about the relationship between loyalty and self expression, between institutional power and individual voice, between the monarchy's right to privacy and the right of those who served it to narrate their own lives. It was the first time the British public had been invited, in a mainstream broadcast format, to consider the possibility that Crawford's punishment had been disproportionate to her offense, and the response suggested that the cultural mood had shifted considerably since 1950. The deference that had sustained the broadsheet condemnation of Crawford was weaker. The public's willingness to question the monarchy's treatment of its servants and its family members had grown. Crawford was beginning to be seen not solely as the woman who had betrayed the royal family, but also, and perhaps more compellingly, as the woman the royal family had destroyed. In 2016, the Netflix series The Crown dramatized Crawford's story in the episode titled Scientia Potentia Est, Knowledge is Power, with the Scottish actress Sarah Vickers playing the governess. The episode was framed around the young Queen Elizabeth's growing anger at the inadequacy of the education she had received, an anger directed partly at Crawford and partly at the system that had deemed a thorough education unnecessary for a princess. The framing was dramatically effective, placing Crawford at the center of a debate about what the monarchy owed the women who served it, what those women were permitted to know, and what happened when the gap between what they were given and what they needed became impossible to ignore. The Crown reached a global audience of tens of millions, and its portrayal of Crawford, sympathetic, recognizably human, caught between genuine affection for the girls she had raised and the institutional ruthlessness that would eventually consume her, introduced her story to a generation that had no living memory of the original scandal. What this series captured was the emotional core. A woman who loved the children she raised and who was punished for the act of saying so in public. What it necessarily simplified, as dramatizations must, was the complexity of Crawford's motives, the ambiguity of Boothlay's role, and the institutional logic that made the punishment feel, from inside the palace, not cruel, but structurally necessary. More recently, the Australian playwright Melanie Tate's stage production, The Queen's Nanny, opened in Sydney in 2024, taking the cultural reappraisal a step further by explicitly recentering Crawford as the protagonist of her own story, rather than a supporting character in the monarchy's narrative. The play treated Crawford's experience as a question about power, voice, and the ownership of memory. Who has the right to narrate the lives they have lived inside an institution? And what happens when that right is claimed by the individual and denied by the institution that claims ownership for the experiences of everyone who enters its orbit? The play was critically well received in Australia and represented in its way the completion of a trajectory that had been building for decades, from scandal object to cautionary tale to tragic figure to recovered human being. The subject of legitimate dramatic and historical inquiry rather than merely a name invoked as a warning. That trajectory is itself a form of vindication, though it is a vindication that Crawford did not live to see. A posthumous recognition that the story she tried to tell in 1950 deserved to be told, and that the punishment she received for telling it deserved to be questioned. What remains of the story, as of the present day, is telling in ways that the participants themselves could not have anticipated, and that illuminate, with a clarity that only time can provide, the enduring tension between institutional memory and individual truth. The Queen Mother died on the 30th of March 2002, at the age of 101, having maintained her refusal to acknowledge Crawford for more than half a century, a period of silence so sustained that it outlasted the Cold War, the decolonization of Africa, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the transformation of the monarchy from a Victorian institution into a modern one. She never relented, not once, not publicly, not privately, not in any way that has been documented. The woman who had once described Crawford as part of her household's intimate circle died having spent 52 consecutive years treating Crawford as though she had never existed. Queen Elizabeth II died on the 8th of September, 2022, at the age of 96, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, not far, in the geography of the country if not of the heart, from the city where Crawford had lived and died. She had reigned for 70 years. She had become the longest-serving monarch in British history. She had navigated crises that would have destroyed lesser institutions and lesser individuals. And she had never, in any public or private way that has been recorded, acknowledged the woman who had taught her to read, who had taken her to Woolworths, who had supervised her Girl Guide badges, who had sat with her through the Blitz, and who had helped form the disciplined, self-contained character that sustained her through 7 decades on the throne. Princess Margaret died on the 9th of February 2002, almost exactly 14 years after Crawford, and just 7 weeks before the Queen Mother, at the age of 71, after years of declining health that had seen her suffer a series of strokes and withdraw progressively from public life. She had spent her adult life navigating the impossible space between royal duty and personal desire, and the parallels with Crawford's story, the gap between what the institution demanded and what the individual needed, the price extracted for transgression, the loneliness that followed, are difficult to ignore, even if Margaret herself would never have drawn them. Both women discovered, in different ways and at different costs, that the House of Windsor's capacity for institutional warmth was matched by its capacity for institutional severity. Margaret complied with the family's verdict on Crawford for the entirety of her adult life. Whether she carried any private grief about that compliance, whether she ever spoke of Crawfie to her children, whether she thought of the governess in her own final years of illness and withdrawal, those are questions that died with her. Margaret's 2 children survive her. David Armstrong Jones, the second Earl of Snowdon, is 64 years old. Lady Sarah Chatto is 62. They are the living inheritors of a family story that includes, somewhere in its margins, a governess who helped raise their mother and their aunt and who was erased from the official record for describing what she had seen. Whether they carry any awareness of Crawford beyond the public narrative, whether Margaret ever spoke of her to them in private, is not known. The royal institution itself continues, under Charles III, navigating the same tension between privacy and public appetite that destroyed Crawford 76 years ago. The code of silence that the Queen Consort enforced with such rigor has been eroded by time, by tabloid culture, by the willingness of later figures, most notably the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, to speak publicly about their experience of the institution in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1950. But the erosion is incomplete. The institution still regards disclosure from within as a threat. The language may have changed. Tell-all memoirs are now discussed in the vocabulary of media rights and mental health rather than loyalty and treason, but the underlying dynamic has not. The palace still believes it owns the narrative of its own private life. The people who have lived inside it still discover, when they attempt to tell their own stories, that the institution's capacity for exclusion has not diminished. Crawford's place inside the official memory of the monarchy remains thin, odd, and revealing. The royal family website, as of this writing, still mentions Marion Crawford in the Diary of Events for the early life of Queen Elizabeth II, acknowledging her in a single line as the woman who supervised the princess's education. The institution cannot quite erase her because she was too present in Elizabeth's formative years to be omitted from any honest account of the Queen's childhood. But the same page gives Crawford an incorrect year of death, listing it as 1999, rather than the actual date of 1988. That error, small bureaucratic, the kind of mistake that reveals institutional indifference rather than institutional malice, captures the entire story in miniature. She is there, she is acknowledged, but she is not carefully remembered. The institution that punished her for describing its private life with affection and accuracy cannot bring itself to record the basic facts of her own life correctly. She exists on the official page as a half-presence, named but not honored, included but not respected, mentioned in the timeline of a queen's childhood but not granted the simple dignity of a correct death date. It is the final, unintended expression of the Windsor Code. She cannot be fully erased because she mattered too much. But she will not be properly remembered, because remembering her properly would mean acknowledging what was done to her. The inheritance that mattered most inside the House of Windsor was never money or land or title. It was silence. The code that passed from George Fa's wartime rebranding through the abdication crisis and the Queen Consort's domestic absolutism and into Elizabeth's own understanding of duty was, at its core, a code of silence. The belief that the private life of the monarchy belonged to the monarchy and that anyone who attempted to narrate it from the outside, however lovingly, was committing an act of trespass. Crawford helped create the emotional world in which Elizabeth learned that code and Margaret learned her place beside it. She helped make the Windsor domestic image warm enough to sustain public affection and controlled enough to survive public scrutiny. And when she tried, after 17 years of service, to describe that world in her own words, the institution she had helped sustain turned on her with a completeness that left nothing. Not a telephone call, not a letter, not a bouquet of flowers at a funeral in Aberdeen. This is not a story about a greedy governess who sold the royal children. It is a story about what monarchy asks of the people who stand nearest to it: intimacy without authorship, devotion without ownership, memory without voice. Marion Crawford gave those things for 17 years. She asked for her voice back once, and the family she had helped raise never forgave her for it.